Welcome to BCM215 Game Media Industries. Nostalgia is one of the most commonly used terms to discuss familiar elements of video games and indeed all media. Nostalgia is a common term in game design, marketing, and the online discussion of games, referring to everything from level mechanics to aesthetics. The first time I heard someone say in a tutorial, this game has Dark Souls feels, I knew I needed to make a lecture on how to unpack the concept of nostalgia. So in this video, I'm going to draw on two different niches within the contemporary game media industries: the retro gaming niche and the indie game design niche, in order to discuss the importance and the influence of nostalgia. The word nostalgia is a portmanteau of the ancient Greek words for vostos, meaning to return home, and algia, meaning both a kind of mental and physical pain. The word was created by the French doctor Johannes Hofer in 1688 as part of his dissertation and used to describe a mental affliction that was common to Swiss mercenaries who had left their homelands to fight in Italy and France. Hofer described nostalgia as demonic possession, an evil which infected the soldiers with intense physical and mental affliction. These Swiss soldiers were known to break down, not from the stress of battle, but from the unnerving longing for the mountainous landscapes of their homes in Switzerland. Unused to fighting in the flat plains and fields of these lowlands of other countries, the Swiss soldiers were disoriented and demoralized. However, Hofer also observed that the Swiss disease manifested physical symptoms, including fainting, fever, stomach pain, and some were even considered to have died from nostalgia. Since then, nostalgia has been associated with negative psychological conditions and chronic mental illness. Until much more recently, nostalgia was considered to be an unhealthy obsession with hanging on to the past. It was typically thought that if you were wrapped up in the past, then you weren't able to move forward as an adult. This is summarized in the often quoted Bible verse: "When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things." I didn't know the exact origin of this quote until I started researching the etymology of nostalgia. I was delighted to find this response from a Quora poster who identified the passage as 1 Corinthians 13, accompanied by the remark that, "I've always hated St. Paul, miserable prick." But perhaps Paul was merely being nostalgic.
Doctor, you're being childish.
Well, of course I am. There's no point in being grown up if you can't be childish sometimes.
Until recently, nostalgia was considered to be dangerous. Taking enjoyment in childish things was seen as a sign of lunacy. I've talked about moral panics in previous lectures, and this fear of nostalgia is another version of the kind of fear-mongering generated by politicians, public figures, and legacy media, which continues even now to build the perception that games are generally dangerous, bad, unhealthy, and have overly toxic audiences and fans. Of course, anything taken to the extreme is unhealthy, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with appreciating objects, locations, and experiences from our past, whether it is from our childhood or during a relationship or while on holiday. This is why we value gifts, photographs, memories, playlists, even certain meals and locations. Nostalgia is a powerful affect, which has made it a common part of participatory media culture, both concepts we've discussed in previous lectures. Affect, argues Gregory and Whitcomb, is an important means for stimulating audience participation, from the process of meaning-making to the more extensive activities of fans. Nostalgia is a powerful affect because it is an embodied form of knowledge that is apprehended by the senses. This is why media companies endlessly remake television series from your childhood. That's why there are so many versions of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Transformers. It's why My Little Pony was so popular and why Disney has great success with very mediocre live-action remakes of its 90s animated musicals. It won't be long before we see remakes of Marvel movies, or Harry Potter, or Lord of the Rings. But of course, reruns often do the job of tapping into the nostalgic urge, and that's why streaming services are willing to pay exorbitant fees for the rights to show the Friends or The Office, despite their age. Nostalgia is often linked to music, books, games, as well as film and television and comics, because of the powerful affective connection between personal and cultural experience. However, nostalgia is not just the experience of meaning-making of the text itself, but the unique experience of where our bodies are and where we were in time and space when enjoying that text. That's why nostalgia often evokes the sensation of what we call homesickness. Nostalgia is such a powerful marketing and advertising force because it is connected to the feelings, encounters, emotions, and other sensations that occur in the places and times that are part of our personal history, that become part of our personal identity. However, more recently, because of the way that internet culture makes history perpetually present, it is revealed that you don't even need to have actual experiences with media of the past in order to have an affective resonance of nostalgia. Music genres like synthwave and vaporwave are popular with audiences who didn't live through the 80s and 90s. This is because as an affect, nostalgia doesn't work on memory and meaning alone. It works through stimulating the senses and enhancing the body's response to various stimuli. While nostalgia might link to specific memories of the past, it can also simply bring forth the feeling of resonance without being distinctly aware of the actual connections to historical conditions. Synthwave, for example, is a simulacrum. It is based on the nostalgia for a vision of the future from the past that never really existed. Just because you didn't experience something directly, it doesn't mean you can't be nostalgic for it. And this brings us to the first game media industry niche that has a distinct range of nostalgic elements: retro games. Retro gaming is the practice of playing and collecting computer games, consoles, and arcade cabinets from previous periods of development, such as the 8-bit, the 16-bit, and early PC eras. Most often, these are based on hardware or operating systems that are considered to be obsolete. Retro games typically have three formats: vintage, emulation or ports, and remakes or re-releases. Vintage retro games means playing games on the original hardware. This is often done by collectors, and it's now actually become quite expensive, particularly as older hardware begins to wear out and becomes scarcer. Emulation involves specialized tools which make copies of the game's code and run an adapter or an interface so that that code can operate on new hardware, typically on PCs, but also on modern consoles. Emulators are contentious within some retro video game communities, where purists argue that the additional features that are often included, such as higher quality graphics, different controller and input support, memory modifications, and so on, all work to reduce the verisimilitude of playing these older games and thus diminish their authenticity as retro experiences. However, the popularity of emulation, thanks to the nostalgia of the retro game experience, has led to a massive popularity of ported games. Ported games differ from emulation in that the original code is rewritten for a new system. We often see this with Doom, for example. And it's made available as quite frequently as official collections for console-based downloads. So you can get ported games on the Nintendo Switch, for example, that existed on previous generations of Nintendo platforms. Remakes are an entirely different and another extremely popular version of retro games. While there are fan-made remakes of games like Half-Life, Super Mario 64, Sonic, Pokemon, GoldenEye, there are also official studio remakes that are the result of publishers and developers reimagining older games, adding new designs, controls, and modern graphics to tap into a market of older gamers nostalgic for their childhood, as well as younger gamers immersed in the manufactured nostalgia of the industry. Recent remakes include Crash Bandicoot, the Insane Trilogy, Legend of Zelda, Link's Awakening, Metroid Resident Evil 2, the Spyro Reignited Trilogy, and of course Pokemon Let's Go. These remakes are aimed at both older players attracted to the nostalgia of the idea of these games, but who want new play experiences with modern graphics, controls, and difficulty settings. The marketing is also directed at attracting new players and younger players who may or may not be aware of these games and their histories. In terms of political economy, the games industry is obviously capitalizing on nostalgia as an opportunity to make a profit through a range of strategies, including tapping into the participatory media culture of retro game communities, but also through remastering and remaking older games through facsimile console packs that resemble previous era hardware. There's also a range of paratextual products like adapters, controllers, and upgrades to support the retro game industry and gameplay, as well as a massive range of merchandise that replicate elements of the 8-bit, 16-bit, and 32-bit era of the industry. There's also an important undercurrent here about the treatment of intellectual property, because while video game artists, designers, and developers are paid for their labor, they're not often reimbursed through the royalty systems that exist for artists in the music, movies, and television industries. This means that remakes are much less costly to develop than new intellectual properties. Also, by remaking and re-releasing video games, the publishers get to relicense and remarket the products associated with them. And so there's a new fresh round of trademarks and copyrights related to these new products. In the reading this week, I've included an article by David Heinemann from the 2014 Journal of Games Criticism titled Public Memory and Gamer Identity, Retro Gaming as Nostalgia. And I want to pick up on just a couple of elements from that article before we move on. Heinemann argues that retro gaming shows how new public memories about the history of games are being rhetorically constructed by participatory media cultures. This is an interesting phenomenon. Much like in the fashion industry, where new products are heavily inspired by the aesthetics and experiences of the recent past, video game nostalgia is a means for individuals to negotiate their identity within carefully manufactured contexts, as to appear outside of the mainstream, but is in fact just another level of consumption. What makes retro gamer identity different is the degree to which the participants can move outside the narrowly defined boundaries of the industry. And this highlights the tension between the retro identity and arguments about authenticity in the vintage, emulation, and remake communities. Heinemann argues that all major entertainment industries are invested in discovering what older intellectual properties resonate with contemporary audiences. In this respect, the video games industry is no different than Hollywood or the music industry. This is because consumers repurchase items from the past or that look like they are from the past, so as to have a material connection to a time and place that has passed, effectively being nostalgic and making purchases and consumption choices based on nostalgia. This occurs not simply as a recollection, but because of the affective textures that accompany these products, such as longing, absence, and sentimentality. Heinemann draws on Pierre Nora's description of nostalgia, that the double imperative derived from the obscuring of the future and the obscuring of the past makes remembering the distinguishing feature of our time. So Heinemann and Nora are making the argument that contemporary culture uses the process of remembering and the affect of nostalgia to come to terms with the chaos of the present. As I mentioned previously, the internet makes the past much more accessible than it has ever been, particularly the recent past. The past was previously seen as history, but it was available in libraries, antique stores, and museums. The internet has made the past present. It has made it much more accessible and immediate. Coupled with the kind of 20-year cycling of fashion and trends and aesthetics, the past is literally present in the everyday experience of nostalgia in popular culture, which is then exploited by the media industries, especially in marketing and advertising. And when I say exploited, I don't mean that's a bad thing. That's obviously a market in operation. Heinemann hints to this in his conclusion, arguing that over time, some narratives persist while others fail or fall away. This struggle is often marked by discrepancies between the official and vernacular discourses about the past, right? The discrepancies between different fan cultures or fan cultures and official records, such as a company's produced book or about the past, right? As the persistence of memory, says Heinemann, is facilitated by access to institutional resources and recognition by publics as a cultural authority, vernacular histories like those in web forums and in community groups and fan groups, right, are always under threat of being forgotten, overwritten, marginalized, or erased. I want to turn now to the second part of this lecture. I want to focus more specifically, so moving away from thinking about how nostalgia works generally in culture to looking at a specific example of how nostalgia is utilized in contemporary video game design. And here I'm going to draw on John Vanderhoff's analysis of the 2014 indie games hit Shovel Knight. And this comes from the awesome book, How to Play Video Games. Nostalgia is obviously a powerful marketing tool in the games industries. And as we said, right, this is because adults who played games early in their life, but may have stopped playing in their teens, but then returned to the experience in their 20s and 30s, then have this kind of romantic association with the freedoms and pleasures of games because of its connection to childhood. One of the functions of nostalgic memory is typically to focus on positive associations with the past. So even people who experience trauma in childhood will actually look back at particular moments and instances with some fondness. Now that's not always, but it's often the case. What makes the nostalgia of game media different from the nostalgia of, say, music is actually its kind of relationship to embodiment. While music and food, for example, can trigger nostalgia for a kind of childhood game or that game right in the home, games are different to, say, music or food or movies, according to Vanderhoff, because they involve a particular array of situated technological limitations that represent a specific place and time. Limitations that manifest in distinct visual styles, gameplay mechanics, and level designs. Together, these elements define each generation of video game technology for players and will often trigger strong feelings of nostalgia, right? They'll bring that affect out. So even in the current era, where nostalgia has been completely blended with game design, and the retro aesthetic of indie games is so prevalent, thanks largely because of the mammoth success of titles like Minecraft, there's still a recognizable media assemblage that will be of this generation, and we'll see it remade in 10 or 20 years, or may not even be remade, but constantly updated, right? We've seen recently an uptake in the popularity of Minecraft, almost 10 years after it was created. So it had its initial surge in popularity, and that starts to fall back. And then as players come back to the game years later, right, it's still the same game, but it's been constantly updated. So rather than the notion of remakes, the industry is organized around this perpetual updating games. This kind of cyclical resurgence of games like Mario Brothers and Minecraft can be attributed to players who picked up the game early on, and then maybe later in life returning to kind of familiar, safe, creative experiences. This is really important because you're never too young to experience nostalgia. Let's talk about Shovel Knight. Shovel Knight involves a strategic deployment of nostalgia, argues Van der Hoef. And it's based on an appeal and reward for players who have knowledge, experience, and familiarity with the kind of cultural economy of video games of the past. Van der Hoef examines Shovel Knight through the triangular analytic framework developed by Stephen Klein, Nick Dyer-Witherford, and Greg Deportier in the 2003 book Digital Play, The Interaction of Technology, Culture, and Marketing, which is still a really important text in video game studies because it helps us to understand the importance of the history of video games within a globalized economy, particularly in terms of technology, economy, and culture, and the relationship between them. Van der Hoef uses this model to examine Shovel Knight's relationship to nostalgia, or what he calls Nestalgia, NES for the Super NES, because it illuminates the rationale behind game developer Yacht Club Games' choice to adhere to decades-old technological limitations, antiquated textual and design influences, and a dedicated marketing campaign that emphasized Shovel Knight's intimate connection with canonical titles in the NES game catalog. In the previous lecture on participatory media culture, we discussed Use Racen's work building on Stuart Hall's model of encoding and decoding and the different ways that audiences make meaning from texts. Similarly, Van der Hoef draws on Svetlana Boym's understanding of two distinct and competing types of nostalgia: restorative nostalgia and reflective nostalgia, in order to understand how the different ways nostalgia works in game design. According to Boyem, restorative nostalgia is an appeal to a paradise lost. It is a wish to recover the pleasures of the past and recreate them in the present. It is often uncritical, paving over past mistakes and failures. It is the opposite of the approach in media archaeology, which we discussed early on in this series. And restorative nostalgia seeks to romanticize and build monuments of glories, right, to moments lost in time. Reflective nostalgia, alternatively, is not concerned with recreating the past exactly, but rather is focused on the affective dimensions of longing. Reflective nostalgia is the attempt to celebrate and create that wistful feeling of nostalgia, like we see in synthwave and vaporwave. Van der Hoef suggests that this form of nostalgia is consumed with the act of longing, a nostalgia that wallows in the pleasure of the irrecoverable ruins of the past. That sensation of ruminating on them to reveal lessons that can be taken forward into the present and the future. So Van der Hoef argues that Shovel Knight exhibits both forms of this nostalgia, both the restorative and the reflective forms of nostalgia, at once reconstructing the textual and mechanical specifics of the past while being aware of the impossibility and frustration of ever attempting to return to it. So Shovel Knight began as a crowd-funded Kickstarter project with an initial goal of $75,000 in 2013. In just 1 month, it raised over $311,000 US, and it was released in June 2014, making its way to Xbox, PlayStation, Windows, OS X, Linux, the Wii U, and most recently the Nintendo Switch. A new spin-off sequel, Shovel Knight Dig, was announced in August 2019, and the game's design is clearly aligned to popular NES games like DuckTales from 1989 and Mega Man from 1987, as well, of course, Zelda 2, The Adventures of Link from Nintendo in 1987. A key feature of the nostalgic game design is the two-dimensional side-scrolling playstyle, which I'm sure you'll recognize, right? It's defined by an iconic hero character who must jump and fight through the level using a signature weapon, in this case, a shovel. to navigate movement puzzles, avoid traps and pitfalls, collect loot, purchase upgrades, battle enemies, and of course defeat the end level boss in order to rescue a long lost friend and a potential love interest, all while, banishing evil from the world of the game. Pretty, kind of standard platformer tropes. Vanderhoff argues that Shovel Knight's developers, Yacht Club Games, went to extensive effort to recreate the original hardware limitations of the NES, not merely nodding towards the retro pixelated aesthetic and design elements of the NES era, but engaged in distinctive restorative nostalgia as a guiding philosophy, shaping character design, sprite size, color choice, and music composition, including featuring tracks from the composer of Mega Man, Manami Matsume. Yacht Club Games, argues Vanderhoff, imagined a world in which the limitations of the original NES cartridge technology continued to advance. This approach pushed the indie developer to expand on the restrictions of the NES, especially what's known as the parallax scrolling, which is the technical design feature in the computer graphics where the background image kind of moves past the camera more slowly than the foregrounded images. And this, of course, creates this illusion of depth and contributes to a sense of progression. Yacht Club Games removed the characteristic flickering of the NES era and uses more than the 54 colors of the console limitation at the time, although the color palette is still quite restricted. In this way, Shovel Knight embraces reflective nostalgia, creating a retro experience that embraces the conventions of the past but is not limited by them. Shovel Knight makes the feel of the NES era available to a new generation of players and older gamers who enjoy the aesthetics and the play style and the mechanics of the era, but who expect more affordances of modern game design. Shovel Knight is embracing restorative nostalgic game design by incorporating the kind of jump and attack and bounce of DuckTales, the theme level design of Mega Man. Shovel Knight is celebrating that climactic boss encounter and the overworld map design of Super Mario Brothers, as well as the kind of treasure collection and player upgrades found in Zelda. Of course, these features are found in new generations, but Shovel Knight restores them to the way that they were presented in the NES era and then organizes gameplay around them. Restorative nostalgia, argues Vanderhoff, operates best when left unchallenged by the realities of the past. An actual return to the past destroys the fantasy of restorative nostalgia, revealing instead something painful, sometimes painful truth that the nostalgic process ameliorates. Restorative nostalgia actively works to avoid this pain. In contrast, reflective nostalgia embraces it, recognizing in the discomfort there's a kind of wisdom gained. This is the key of Shovel Knight's success. It goes to extensive lengths to recapture the best of the NES generation's mechanics, characters, music, and graphics without being restricted to the limitations of that era, which were at times uncomfortable, difficult, and not fun. Although an indie game developed by an independent game studio, Yacht Club Games, the studio partnered with Nintendo during the development of the game, which led to marketing support and direct development support, including sponsorship and promotion, which benefited both companies. Although the Wii U console basically failed as a platform, the lessons learned by the company were very heavily realized and led to the incredible success of the Nintendo Switch, which has embraced the indie game genre via its e-store, and games like Shovel Knight that celebrate the 8-bit and 16-bit era can be directly downloaded from Nintendo. Shovel Knight and games like it draw on the best characteristics of the top-rated games of the NES era to sell Nintendo's past to both the generation that grew up with the original games and their children, and will be their grandchildren. As Van der Hoff suggests, Nintendo is making use of the almost instant iconic status of its character design to build a successful business strategy around their property, in just the same way that Netflix used series like Stranger Things and other television shows have done with 80s horror and the weird science fiction genres that were popular in the 80s, like Stephen King and John Carpenter. And of course, Dungeons and Dragons. It's also important to point out that Stranger Things features a really killer retro synthwave soundtrack. All right, I'm going to conclude now with two very brief points from Van der Hoff about nostalgic game design. First is the success of games designed with both restorative and reflective nostalgia in mind, like Shovel Knight, Minecraft, and most recently Animal Crossing, successfully challenged the dominance of the AAA games, right? The super high-end, high-fidelity types of aesthetics and narratives and technical elements of games that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to develop and advertise. The success of returning to the past helps to ensure the availability of other types of game experiences for a wide range of audiences. Which leads to the second point that Van der Hoff says retro video games like Shovel Knight are an increasingly central genre within the indie game development because they ask us to continually evaluate our individual and collective relationship to the past. They ask us to interrogate personal and industrial forms of nostalgia, to mediate on the place, not just the text, both within the complex and dynamic cultural economy of video game development and its play, right? Its consumption. That's it for this lecture. Thanks very much for playing.